The morning sun peeked through the sleek glass windows of San Francisco International Airport as Victoria Wells rushed through security, her small carry-on rolling smoothly behind her. Even after 10 years of being a billionaire, she still packed light. A habit from her early days when she could barely afford bus tickets, let alone first-class flights. Today wasn't just another business trip. Victoria's tech company was on the verge of a breakthrough deal that could bring affordable internet to rural communities across the globe. The board meeting in New York wasn't just about profits. It was about changing lives. She checked her simple silver watch, a gift from her grandmother who'd raised her in a small apartment above their family's bookstore. 45 minutes until boarding. Perfect timing. Unlike many CEOs, Victoria always arrived early, treating every minute as precious as the dollars that now filled her bank account. The airport staff going about their morning routines had no idea that the woman in the navy blue blazer and comfortable flats was worth billions. Victoria liked it that way. Her grandmother had taught her that true class wasn't about showing off, but about how you treated others. She smiled warmly at the barista who handed her a simple black coffee, leaving a generous tip as always. Walking to her gate, Victoria scrolled through the presentation on her phone one last time. The numbers were solid, but what made her proud were the potential impact statistics. Millions of children who could access online education, thousands of small businesses that could reach global markets, and countless families who could stay connected across continents. At the gate, she sat quietly, reviewing her notes while observing fellow travelers. Business people in crisp suits, families heading for vacations, students with backpacks stuffed full of dreams. Each person had a story, and Victoria never forgot that she was once just another face in the crowd, dreaming big while surviving on instant noodles and determination. Her phone buzzed with a message from her team back at headquarters. The prototype tests were successful. Another piece of good news for the board meeting. Victoria allowed herself a small smile, remembering the days when her company operated out of her tiny apartment, with only a rescue cat as her coworker. As boarding began, she waited patiently in line, politely declining when other passengers offered to let her go ahead. The weight of the upcoming meeting sat comfortably on her shoulders. Years of experience had taught her that pressure was just opportunity in disguise. She hadn't told anyone, but this deal meant more to her than just business success. Growing up, she'd watched her grandmother struggle to keep their tiny bookstore alive because they couldn't afford the high-speed internet needed for online sales. Now she had the chance to solve that problem for millions of others like them. Standing at the entrance to the jet bridge, Victoria took a deep breath of the cool morning air. The rising sun painted the sky in shades of hope, and she felt that familiar surge of excitement that came with every new challenge. Little did she know that this routine flight would turn into one of the most significant moments of her life. Not because of the deal waiting in New York, but because of what was about to unfold at 35,000 feet. Her boarding pass felt warm in her hands as she walked down the jet bridge, mind already mapping out the conversations she'd have in New York. She'd learned long ago that success wasn't just about having the right answers. It was about asking the right questions and listening with an open heart. Would you like me to continue expanding the next parts of the story? I can maintain this engaging, personal style while keeping the language accessible and the narrative focused on human elements. Victoria settled into her first-class seat, carefully placing her laptop bag under the seat in front. The leather seat felt familiar. She'd been on this same flight route dozens of times before. The morning light streamed through the small window, catching the silver threads in her neatly braided hair. She'd earned every one of those gray strands building her company from scratch. A young flight attendant smiled warmly at her, offering a pre-flight drink. Victoria asked for water, her usual choice. She never forgot the importance of staying hydrated during long flights. A tip she'd learned from her very first business trip, when she was so nervous she'd forgotten to drink anything and ended up with a splitting headache. As other passengers boarded, Victoria observed their routine with quiet interest. A mother trying to calm her excited toddler, a businessman struggling with his oversized carry-on, an elderly couple helping each other find their seats. These everyday moments always reminded her why she loved traveling. Each flight was like a tiny community coming together for a few shared hours. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing his presence. Captain Richard Thompson's voice carried an edge of authority that made Victoria pause mid-sip. Something about his tone seemed different from the usual pilot announcements, more clipped, less welcoming. When the captain emerged from the cockpit for his pre-flight cabin walkthrough, Victoria noticed how his friendly nods and greetings to other first-class passengers turned to a sharp stare when he reached her row. His eyes narrowed, scanning her appearance, from her simple pearl earrings to her practical flats. She'd seen that look before. It was the same look she'd gotten walking into high-end stores in her early days, the look that said, "You don't belong here." Back then, it had stung. Now, after years of breaking barriers and building success, she'd learned to meet such looks with quiet dignity. The captain stopped directly beside her seat. His badge gleamed under the cabin lights as he crossed his arms. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet cabin. "Are you sure this is your seat?" Victoria felt the familiar weight in her stomach, the one that came with these moments. Around her, conversations hushed. Other passengers turned to watch, some with concern, others with uncomfortable recognition of what was unfolding. She reached for her boarding pass, even though she knew exactly where she was supposed to be. Seat 2A, the same seat she'd chosen on countless flights before. But something told her this wasn't really about the seat number. The air felt thick with tension as she handed over her boarding pass. The captain studied it longer than necessary, turning it over in his hands as if expecting to find evidence of forgery. Victoria maintained her composure, her grandmother's words echoing in her mind. "Your dignity is not up for debate." Other passengers had started to notice the unusual scrutiny. A few pulled out their phones, their cameras discreetly pointing toward the scene. Victoria could feel their eyes, some sympathetic, others curious, as the captain continued his unnecessary inspection. She thought about all the young women who might someday face similar moments. In her success, she'd learned that sometimes the most powerful response to prejudice was calm strength. Each of these moments wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who would come after. The irony wasn't lost on her. In a few hours, she'd be leading a board meeting about a multi-billion-dollar deal, yet here she was, being questioned about her right to sit in a seat she'd paid for. But Victoria knew that what happened next would matter, not just for this flight, but for the bigger story of change that needed to be told. Would you like me to continue with expanding part 3? I can maintain this engaging style while developing the tension and keeping the narrative accessible and authentic. "I need to see your boarding pass again," the captain demanded, his voice carrying through the first-class cabin. Victoria felt every eye on her as she calmly reached for the document she'd shown just moments before. The morning sunlight streaming through the window suddenly felt too bright, too exposing. A woman across the aisle shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her coffee untouched. The businessman in front had turned around, no longer pretending to read his newspaper. The quiet hum of the airplane's systems seemed to grow louder in the tense silence. "Perhaps you've wandered into the wrong section," the captain continued, his tone dripping with false concern. "Economy class is further back." He gestured toward the rear of the plane, making no attempt to lower his voice. Victoria noticed how he emphasized economy, as if the word itself was evidence of his assumptions. 20 years of building a tech empire had taught Victoria plenty about handling difficult moments. She'd faced skeptical investors, hostile competitors, and countless doubters. But this felt different, more personal, more raw. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "Sometimes the strongest response is simply refusing to let them see you sweat." "My seat is right here," Victoria replied, her voice steady and clear. She pointed to her boarding pass, where 2A was clearly printed. as it was the first 2 times you checked. A few passengers nodded in approval at her composed response. The captain's face reddened slightly. Well, there have been incidents of people trying to upgrade themselves. He paused, looking around as if seeking support from other passengers. Finding none, he added, "We have to be thorough with our security checks." Victoria removed her company ID from her bag, not because she needed to prove anything, but because sometimes education was the best response to ignorance. "I'm the CEO of Well Tech Industries," she stated, not as a boast, but as a simple fact. "I've flown this route monthly for the past 5 years." A young flight attendant approached, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. She started to say something, but the captain cut her off with a sharp gesture. Victoria noticed how the attendant's hands trembled slightly as she stepped back. Another person feeling the weight of this moment. A CEO. The captain's tone was thick with disbelief. Of Well Tech. He laughed, a short, harsh sound that echoed in the quiet cabin. "And I suppose next you'll tell me you own the airline too." The elderly man sitting by the window 2 rows ahead turned around fully now. "Young man," he addressed the captain, his voice carrying the weight of years, "I've sat on enough corporate boards to recognize Victoria Wells. You're making a terrible mistake." Victoria watched something flicker across the captain's face. Confusion, then recognition, then the beginning of fear. She'd seen this expression before, the moment when prejudice collided with reality. But she wasn't interested in his fear or his shame. She was interested in change. "Captain," she said, keeping her voice level, "I believe we both know what's happening here. The question is, what are we going to do about it?" She held his gaze, not in challenge, but in invitation. An invitation to be better. Other passengers had their phones out now, recording openly. In the age of social media, moments like these rarely stayed private. But Victoria wasn't thinking about viral videos or public outrage. She was thinking about the young girl in economy class who might be watching, learning how to handle unfairness with grace. The tension in the cabin had reached a breaking point. The air felt electric, with unspoken words and suppressed reactions. Whatever happened next would ripple far beyond this flight, beyond this moment. Victoria knew it, the passengers knew it, and now, finally, the captain was beginning to understand it too. "Would you like me to continue with part 4? I can maintain this level of engagement while developing the story further, keeping the focus on human interactions and meaningful dialogue." The cabin buzzed with whispered conversations and the soft clicks of phone cameras. A young woman in row 3 had been live streaming the entire incident, her hands steady as she captured every moment. The morning light caught the tears in her eyes. Not tears of sadness, but of recognition. She'd been here before, maybe not in first class, but in those moments when someone decided she didn't belong. A business reporter from the Wall Street Journal, seated in 3B, had already pulled out his laptop. His fingers flew across the keyboard, decades of journalistic instinct kicking in. He'd interviewed Victoria Wells 3 times before. Once when her company went public, again when she launched her education initiative, and last year when she made the cover of Time magazine. The flight attendant who had tried to intervene earlier stood near the galley, her hands clasped tightly together. She'd seen Victoria on this flight route many times, always kind, always leaving generous tips for the crew, never making demands like some other first-class passengers. Now she watched helplessly as her captain, her superior, continued to dig himself deeper into a hole of his own making. "This is our flight's top-tier passenger," the flight attendant finally spoke up, her voice quivering but determined. "Ms. Wells has platinum status with us." She held up her tablet, showing the captain the passenger manifest, trying to end the situation professionally. A couple sitting across the aisle exchanged glances. The woman reached for her husband's hand, squeezing it tight. They'd been watching everything unfold, remembering similar moments from their own lives. The times when their success was questioned, when their presence was treated as suspicious. In economy class, word had spread quickly. Passengers craned their necks, trying to see what was happening up front. A teacher on her way to a conference pulled out her phone, already thinking about how this moment could become a lesson in her classroom about courage and dignity. Back in first class, a tech startup founder who'd been inspired by Victoria's career couldn't stay quiet any longer. Her company's new satellite internet project is about to change millions of lives, she announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. I was at the press conference last month. The captain's face had gone from red to pale. His hands, still holding Victoria's boarding pass, trembled slightly. The weight of his mistake was beginning to sink in, not just a mistake of protocol, but a deeper, more human error. Phone cameras caught everything. The way Victoria sat, straight-backed but relaxed, her eyes never leaving the captain's face. The supportive nods from other passengers. The growing realization on the captain's face that this was no ordinary confrontation. A group of college students in premium economy had their phones out too, already sharing the story on social media. One of them, an aspiring software engineer, typed furiously. Watching history unfold. This is why representation matters. This is why we need to keep pushing forward. The cabin crew huddled near the galley, whispering urgently into their phones. Ground staff needed to be notified. Supervisors needed to be called. This wasn't just an incident anymore. It was becoming a moment that would be discussed in training sessions and boardrooms for years to come. Through it all, Victoria remained the eye of the storm, calm, composed, watching as phones recorded and passengers murmured. She'd built her career on turning challenges into opportunities, and even now, her mind was working, thinking about how this moment could become something more than just another viral video of injustice. Would you like me to continue with part 5? I can maintain this level of detail and engagement while moving the story forward, keeping the focus on the human elements and the ripple effects of this confrontation. The truth broke like a wave across the cabin when a tech journalist in row 4 stood up, his tablet displaying the Forbes magazine cover from last month. That's Victoria Wells, he announced, his voice carrying the weight of certainty. She's not just a CEO. She's the woman who revolutionized global internet access. The captain's face transformed as if someone had flipped a switch. His eyes darted from the magazine cover to Victoria's face, then back again. The realization hit him like a physical force, and he took an involuntary step backward, nearly bumping into another passenger's seat. A soft murmur rippled through the cabin as more passengers pulled up news articles and photos on their phones. She donated $50 million to rural education last year, someone whispered. My cousin's school got computers because of her program, added another voice from further back. Victoria watched the captain's transformation with a mixture of sadness and understanding. She'd seen this moment before, the sudden shift from contempt to recognition, from superiority to embarrassment. But she wasn't interested in his shame. She was focused on something bigger. The flight attendant's tablet dinged with urgent messages from ground control. The flight was now running 15 minutes behind schedule. In the world of commercial aviation, every minute of delay cost thousands of dollars. But this moment was worth more than money. It was about dignity, respect, and change. Other passengers began sharing their own stories in hushed voices. An older businessman mentioned how his daughter had started coding because of Victoria's youth programs. A college student whispered about the scholarship she'd received from Welltech's Education Foundation. The tech journalist, still standing, continued, Ms. Wells is scheduled to announce a groundbreaking project next week. Something that could bring high-speed internet to the most remote parts of the world. He looked directly at the captain. And you just accused her of being in the wrong section. Victoria finally stood up, smoothing her blazer with practiced calm. She was used to being in the spotlight, but not like this. This wasn't about her success or her wealth. This was about something far more fundamental, the right to be treated with basic human dignity. Captain, she said, her voice clear and steady, I believe we have two choices right now. We can let this become another viral story about discrimination in the airline industry, or we can turn it into an opportunity for real change. She paused, letting her words sink in. Which would you prefer? The cabin fell silent. Even the constant hum of the aircraft's systems seemed to quiet down. Phones kept recording, capturing this moment when power dynamics shifted, when prejudice met its match in quiet dignity. Through the windows, the morning sun continued to rise, casting long shadows across the cabin. Time seemed to stand still as everyone waited for the captain's response. This wasn't just about one flight anymore. It had become a moment that would be remembered, shared, and discussed long after everyone had reached their destinations. A child in premium economy asked his mother, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Mom, why did the pilot think she couldn't sit here?" The innocence of the question cut through the tension, reminding everyone of the deeper impact these moments had on future generations. The captain looked around the cabin, seeing not just passengers now, but witnesses to his prejudice. His authority, usually absolute in this metal tube hurtling through the sky, had been transformed by his own actions into something else entirely. A teachable moment about bias, power, and the courage to face one's mistakes. Would you like me to continue with part 6? I'll maintain this level of engagement while moving the story forward, focusing on how this situation begins to resolve itself. The ground staff arrived at the cabin door, their faces showing concern as they took in the scene. The head of airport operations, a woman with silver-streaked hair and years of experience handling difficult situations, made her way to Victoria's seat. Behind her, 2 airline supervisors whispered urgently into their phones. "Ms. Wells," the operations head said softly, "we are deeply sorry for this incident. We can arrange another flight for you immediately." She glanced at the captain, who stood rigid and pale, his earlier authority completely deflated. Victoria shook her head, a gentle smile crossing her face. "I don't need another flight," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "What we need is a conversation about why this happened, and how we can prevent it from happening to anyone else." The delay now stretched to 25 minutes. Passengers who had been checking their watches and sighing about missed connections fell silent. They recognized that they were witnessing something more important than a simple flight delay. A flight attendant distributed water bottles to nearby passengers, her hands still trembling slightly. When she reached Victoria, she whispered, "Thank you for handling this with such grace. My daughter wants to be like you when she grows up." The airline supervisors huddled near the galley, papers rustling as they documented the incident. One of them kept glancing at his phone, where notifications about the incident were already popping up on social media. The hashtag first class woman was trending. Victoria stood up, smoothing her blazer once again. "I'd like to speak with your senior management," she said to the operations head. "Not to file a complaint, but to discuss implementing a comprehensive training program." Her voice carried the same authority she used in board meetings, but with an added note of compassion. The tech journalist had finished typing his article. His fingers hovered over the send button as he watched Victoria handle the situation. This wasn't just news anymore. It was a masterclass in turning confrontation into conversation. Other passengers began sharing their own stories more openly now. A grandmother spoke about facing similar treatment at a high-end store. A young professional mentioned the subtle discrimination he encountered in corporate meetings. The cabin had become a space for honest dialogue about everyday prejudice. The captain, still standing nearby, seemed to shrink with each passing moment. His uniform, usually a symbol of authority, now seemed to weigh heavily on his shoulders. The reality of his actions, and their consequences, was sinking in deeply. Through the cabin windows, other planes taxied past, their passengers unaware of the profound moment unfolding in this stationary aircraft. The morning sun had risen higher, its warm light filling the cabin, as if nature itself was illuminating this moment of truth and transformation. Victoria pulled out her phone and opened her calendar. "I suggest we schedule a meeting for next week," she said to the airline officials. My team can present some ideas about how to turn this incident into an opportunity for positive change. The other passengers watched in admiration. Instead of anger or revenge, they were witnessing someone choose education and progress. Photos and videos continued to be taken, but now they captured something different. Not just a moment of injustice, but the beginning of a solution. Would you like me to continue with part 7? I'll maintain this level of engagement while showing how Victoria begins to transform this challenging situation into an opportunity for positive change. 3 days after the incident, Victoria sat in her office overlooking the city skyline. Her desk was covered with emails and messages from people who'd seen the viral videos of the flight incident. But one letter caught her attention more than the others. A handwritten note from a young girl in Detroit who dreamed of becoming a pilot. The airline's senior executives had called an emergency meeting the day after the incident. They expected demands, threats of lawsuits, or at least a public relations nightmare. Instead, they found Victoria armed with a detailed proposal for change. Let's create something meaningful from this, she told the airline's boardroom full of nervous executives. Her presentation displayed on the screen behind her showed statistics about bias in the aviation industry. We have an opportunity to lead by example. Victoria's foundation had already drafted a comprehensive training program. It wasn't just about avoiding discrimination. It was about understanding human dignity, recognizing unconscious bias, and building a culture of genuine respect. The cost of the program would be significant: $2 million for initial development and implementation. Before the airline executives could voice their concerns about the budget, Victoria announced that her foundation would cover half the cost. Consider it an investment in humanity, she said. Back in her office, Victoria reviewed the draft of the training materials. They included real-world scenarios, personal stories, and practical strategies for creating an inclusive environment. But most importantly, they emphasized understanding and growth rather than blame and shame. Her phone buzzed with a message from her grandmother. You turned lemons into lemonade, just like I taught you, it read. Victoria smiled, remembering all the times her grandmother had shown her how to face injustice with grace and determination. The incident had sparked conversations across the industry. Other airlines began reaching out, asking about implementing similar training programs. Victoria's inbox filled with messages from flight attendants sharing their own experiences and thanking her for taking a stand. A group of young aviation students had started an online petition asking for industry-wide changes in training and hiring practices. Victoria's story had given them courage to speak up about their own challenges and hopes for the future. The training program wasn't just about watching videos or attending lectures. It included mentorship opportunities, community engagement, and regular feedback sessions. Real change happens through connection, Victoria explained to her team as they finalized the details. Her assistant brought in the latest social media reports. The hashtag had evolved from anger about the incident to excitement about the changes being implemented. People were sharing stories of positive interactions with airline staff, creating a ripple effect of kindness and understanding. Victoria picked up the letter from the young girl in Detroit again. Dear Ms. Wells, it read, "Thank you for showing me that when someone tries to bring you down, you can lift everyone up instead." She decided this letter would be framed and hung in the training center. The airline's CEO had called earlier that morning, sharing surprising news. Applications for flight training programs had increased, especially from minority candidates. Victoria's story had inspired people to pursue their dreams, regardless of the obstacles they might face. Would you like me to continue with Part 8? I'll maintain this engaging narrative while showing how personal transformation can lead to broader social change. 1 month after the incident, Victoria's assistant announced an unexpected visitor at her office. The captain stood in the reception area, no longer wearing his uniform, holding a small envelope in his trembling hands. He looked different now, humbled, older somehow, as if the past month had aged him years. His request for a meeting had surprised everyone, but Victoria had agreed immediately. She believed in second chances, in the power of honest conversations to change hearts. "Please, have a seat." Victoria gestured to the chair across from her desk. The city sprawled below them through floor-to-ceiling windows, a reminder of how far she'd come from her grandmother's small bookstore. The captain sat down carefully, as if the chair might break under the weight of his conscience. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been watching your interviews, reading about your journey." He paused, gathering courage. "My granddaughter showed me your speech from last year's tech conference. She didn't know it was me, the pilot from the incident." Victoria listened quietly, giving him space to find his words. On her desk sat the framed letter from the young girl in Detroit, a reminder of why this conversation mattered. "I grew up in a different time," he continued, "but that's no excuse. I've spent the past month really looking at myself, at my assumptions." He pulled a worn notebook from his pocket, filled with handwritten notes. "I've been journaling, trying to understand why I did what I did." The captain had taken a voluntary leave of absence from flying. Instead of hiding from his mistake, he'd enrolled himself in diversity awareness programs. He'd reached out to minority pilot associations, asking to learn from their experiences. "My daughter's a software engineer," he shared, his voice cracking slightly. "She faces discrimination all the time in her field. When she found out what I did," he wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, "she made me see myself through her eyes." Victoria opened her desk drawer and pulled out a folder. "I have something to show you," she said, spreading out photographs from her early days. Pictures of her working late nights in her tiny apartment, of the first office she could barely afford, of her grandmother standing proud at the company's opening. "Success doesn't look like what people expect," she said gently. "Neither does prejudice. Sometimes it wears a uniform. Sometimes it sits in a boardroom. Sometimes it stands behind a store counter." The captain nodded, understanding flowing between them. "I want to help," he said finally. "I've been teaching other pilots for years about safety procedures. Maybe I could help teach them about this too." Victoria smiled, reaching for her laptop. "Actually, I have a proposal for you." She pulled up a presentation of the new training program. "We need someone who understands both sides of this story. Someone who can speak from experience about the journey from bias to awareness." The afternoon light filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across her office. Two people sat there, not a victim and an offender, but two human beings finding common ground in the hard work of personal growth. "Would you like me to continue with Part 9? I'll maintain this level of engagement while bringing the story to a meaningful conclusion that shows the lasting impact of this transformation." 6 months passed, and the small incident on a morning flight had grown into something much bigger than anyone expected. The airline's training center buzzed with activity as a new group of staff members gathered for their morning session. At the front of the room stood two unlikely teaching partners, Victoria and the former captain. "Welcome to day 1, Victoria announced to the room filled with pilots, flight attendants, and ground crew. "Today, we're going to talk about moments that change us." Behind her, a screen displayed newspaper headlines about the incident, but they weren't there to shame anyone. They were there to show how change was possible. The former captain stepped forward, his voice steady now when he spoke about that morning. "I thought I knew what a successful person looked like," he told the group. "I thought I could judge someone's worth by their appearance. I was wrong." The room fell silent, everyone leaning in to listen. The training program had spread beyond just one airline. 5 major carriers had adopted it, with 3 more scheduled to start next month. Industry magazines were calling it the First Class Change Initiative, a name that made Victoria smile at its double meaning. In the back of the room sat an older woman, Victoria's grandmother, watching proudly as her granddaughter turned a moment of prejudice into a movement for change. She remembered the little girl who used to arrange her bookstore shelves, dreaming of bigger things. The morning session included real stories from airline staff about times they'd faced or witnessed discrimination. A young flight attendant shared how she'd learned to speak up when she saw something wrong. A veteran pilot admitted how he discovered his own hidden biases. Victoria's tech company had developed a special app for the program. It let staff members share experiences, ask questions, and support each other. The app had already logged thousands of conversations, each one a small step toward understanding. During breaks, Victoria would often show visitors the wall of letters in the training center. Hundreds of messages from people around the world, sharing how the story had touched them. One letter was larger than the others, the one from the young girl in Detroit. She was now enrolled in flight school. The former captain had found his calling in teaching these sessions. His story of transformation resonated deeply with others who recognized their own prejudices. "It's not about being perfect," he would say. "It's about being willing to learn and change." News channels had picked up the story again, but this time focusing on the positive changes sweeping through the airline industry. Employment statistics showed more diverse hiring, especially in leadership positions. Customer satisfaction scores were rising across all airlines that had adopted the program. As the morning session ended, Victoria watched the participants talking among themselves, sharing experiences and insights. This wasn't just corporate training, it was human beings connecting, understanding, growing. Her phone buzzed with a message. Another airline CEO wanted to implement the program. Then another message, a school district asking if they could adapt the training for teachers. The ripples of change kept spreading, touching more lives than she could have imagined. Outside the training center's windows, planes took off and landed in the distance. Each one carried people from all walks of life, all with their own stories, all deserving of respect. The incident that could have ended in anger had instead opened doors of understanding that would never fully close again. Would you like me to expand on any particular aspect of this conclusion? I can focus more on specific impacts, personal stories, or the broader changes in the industry while maintaining this engaging and human-centered approach.